Alrighty, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Government Finance Officers Association's training on financial foundations for thriving communities. This is pillar number 4, where we're going to talk about creating clear rules. This webinar is approximately 2 hours in length and worth 2 continuing professional education credits based on a 50-minute hour. All participants' connections have been placed on mute to prevent any background noise. If you have questions about the presentation, you can submit them using the Q&A feature in the event management system. If we have time at the end, we will address all of those questions. Also, at the conclusion of the event, you will be redirected to a short survey to evaluate the content of today's presentation. We encourage you to fill that survey out. That's pretty valuable to us, those survey results, so we appreciate you taking the time to do that. CPE certificates will be sent to all paid participants in the mail in approximately 2 to 3 weeks. Okay, so let's get started. Our speakers for today are Mark Day. Mark is the Municipal Budget Director for the City of Tempe, Arizona. Greg Devereaux, who's the retired CEO from the County of San Bernardino, California. And slight change, we were going to have with us today Paul Gudgerson, who's the retired city manager for the City of San Clemente, California. But Paul came down with a ill-timed case of laryngitis. So he's on and listening today, so we thank him for that, but he has no voice, unable to speak. So luckily, at the last minute, my colleague Shane Kavanaugh, who's the senior manager for research here at GFOA, was able to join us. So we will have Shane's expertise as well. And again, my name is Katie Ludwig. I'm a senior manager here at GFOA. So we are going to go ahead and get started into our presentation for today. And everyone, please excuse me. I don't have laryngitis, but I'm getting over a cold, so my voice is a little froggy and I've got a bit of a cough. So bear with me on that too. Okay, so today we are talking about financial foundations for thriving communities, which is a new initiative rolled out by GFOA earlier this year. And one of the reasons we came up with our framework here for the financial foundations framework, as we call it, is because really we heard from our members that maintaining a strong financial foundation is a big concern of theirs. In our last member survey, 7 of the top 10 concerns that were listed by people had to do in some way, shape, or form with their financial foundation, financial sustainability, something to that effect. So we know that this is something that's on our members' minds, very concerning to them, and we realized that we really wanted to give them some tools, help them develop strategies to address those concerns. So what's special about this framework? What do we want people to know about this framework? Why do we think it's helpful, useful, and really can address those concerns? Well, there's a couple different reasons. First is that it really makes finance everyone's business. So because a city's or a county's, a local government's finances are this shared resource, everyone is involved in using those resources. So really, everyone needs to be involved in solidifying and strengthening those resources. And this framework gives you the tools to kind of help make finance everyone's business. In addition, it really goes beyond the numbers. So as I think about it, I think sometimes the numbers are the easy part of our jobs as finance officers, and the harder part is managing those relationships, managing organizations, getting people to work together. That is really the hard part, and this framework, again, goes beyond the numbers and really gets to the heart of a lot of those more kind of leadership strategies. It's also based on accurate models of behavior. We have a book coming out very shortly, hopefully within the next month, on the framework, and the book really gets into this in a lot more detail, but the framework, again, is compatible with a lot of findings in behavioral science. So again, I think I enjoy those examples in the book, and I really encourage you when the book comes out to take a look at that. And then finally, the last thing about the framework is that it works. It's demonstrated by governments, actual governments. The folks on the panel today can tell you about their experiences with it. The development of the framework was based on lots of reviews of case studies and interviews with people, and you'll hear about some of those today. So our hope is today that you can come away with some strategies that you can adopt to really apply this back at your organization in the future. Okay, so a couple things I want to talk about in terms of what the framework includes. So we have, the framework itself is made up of 5 pillars, and underneath each of the 5 pillars, we have leadership strategies and institutional design principles. So about these leadership strategies, these are really things that you can do as a leader within your organization. So because we can't just tell people to do things, we can't say, hey, I'm gonna order you to behave more sustainably. I'm gonna ask you to do this. You have to come up with ways to help them help you, right? So we talk about inspiring pride and loyalty and enthusiasm so that people want to do this. And again, the framework includes these strategies that can help you as a leader inspire that in the people around you and in the folks in your organization. The other thing the framework includes, again, are these institutional design principles. These are basically the things that you need to put in place or need to be put in place in your organization. So they're characteristics of the organization. Whereas the leadership strategies I think of as more as individual things that you can do. The design principles are more like what you need to put in place in your organization. They do, again, provide some context for the leadership strategies, but there are more ways you can change your organization. So again, we're going to talk about both of those today. So again, here is the framework itself. This is a high-level view. We have the 5 pillars. I'll go over those. The first pillar is to establish a long-term vision. Again, we talk about how people need a reason to cooperate, and often that long-term vision for the future, what that looks like, is what can give people a reason to cooperate. That's what gets people to say, okay, hey, yeah, I'm bought into this. I'm going to do X, Y, or Z because I really believe in that vision for the future. The second pillar is building trust and open communication. Again, this is the underpinning of the framework, really talks about so much about collaboration and cooperation. And so, again, that is built on both trust and open communication. You can't have, I feel like, collaboration or cooperation without both of those things. The third pillar is collective decision making. And really, you can see how each of these pillars builds upon one another, right? So the vision is connected to the open trust, or excuse me, trust and open communication, which is then builds to using collective decision making. So you want people to participate both, internally and externally. And then finally, what we're talking about here today is creating clear rules. Actually, and I shouldn't say finally because I don't want to shortchange pillar number 5, which will be the topic of our next webinar. But that is all about treating folks fairly, treat everyone fairly to promote and protect trust and respect. But again, today we're going to zero in on that pillar number 4, create clear rules, and how clear rules can reinforce constructive behavior, reinforce and really bolster cooperation and collaboration, and really how creating clear rules in the form of policies, procedures, things like that really do create the environment needed for collaboration and cooperation. Okay, so we have one leadership strategy that falls under the pillar number 4, and that is maintain oversight. So this is something that, as a leader, we want to maintain oversight because, again, cooperation, as it says here, key to thriving communities. We can do that. We can reinforce cooperation as a finance officer through the power of the purse strings. And another part that, again, I feel like we often don't talk about in our role as finance officers, though, is encouraging a culture of shared values and how we can do that. And again, I think A couple of our presenters today are going to share their experiences on this and how you can create a culture of shared values through your budget process and things like that. Then under pillar number 4, we also have these 3 institutional design principles. So again, these are sort of characteristics or things you need to put in place in your organization. And so the first of those is well-defined boundaries. So this is the rules, right? What are the rules of the game? We talk specifically about kind of 2 different kinds of boundaries. We talk about decision boundaries, which is sort of who shares, who controls resources, what can be done with those resources, those kind of things. And then we talk about temporal boundaries. So obviously temporal has to do with time, so things like deadlines, timelines, and how we can use temporal boundaries to really get us thinking, get the organization thinking more long-term. The second institutional design principle that we talk about under this pillar is monitoring. So once you've established the rules, the boundaries, you then need to monitor those. And so everyone's got to follow the rules. We have to hold folks accountable to those. And the reason that's important is that if you don't hold, without holding people accountable, they might kind of cheat here every now and then. But if they know they're being watched, they know they're being monitored, people are much more likely to follow those rules. There's actually, again, in the book, there's some really good examples from behavioral science that sort of back this up. But right, when people know they're being monitored, they're going to follow those rules, play fair, and be more cooperative. So that's why the monitoring is so important. And then the third institutional design principle that we're talking about is the use of sanctions and rewards. So we know that incentives can encourage both good and bad behaviors, and we need to know the difference and set those up accordingly. What I like, too, is that sometimes we need to take away disincentives. So, and we're going to, again, take away the barriers to doing the right things, that can sometimes be a reward in and of itself, and so we talk about that. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So before we jump into, I did want to talk, well, let's jump into our questions here. Okay, so we have a poll question. We'll have a couple poll questions throughout the presentation today, and this is our first poll question. So, does your organization have written financial policies and or procedures? Again, we often think of financial policies and procedures as sort of the rules of the game for us, and so how does your organization have those? So the choices we have here are, yes, we have written formal financial policies and procedures in place. We have informal financial policies and procedures, but they aren't written down anywhere. We're a really small organization, so we don't think we need financial policies or procedures. Or D, we have a really old set of financial policies that no one really pays any attention to. So take a second, think about this, and kind of tell us where you fall in this. Okay, the poll closed. I'm just waiting for a second for it to calculate the answers and see where everyone landed. Okay, well, this is great news. It's about 53% of the respondents chose A, that we do have written formal financial policies and procedures in place. Smaller percentage said that we have informal financial policies and procedures and they aren't written down anywhere. And then just very few people, about 3% answered C and 8% of folks said D. So first, I'm really glad to hear that so many people do have policies in place. And for the folks who answered B, C, or D, hopefully today you'll learn some tips and here are some things to kind of help you as you maybe decide to put those policies in place. Second question, how well are your financial policies and procedures communicated to both internal and external stakeholders? Are all stakeholders aware of your financial policies and procedures? Again, this is really important too. If you don't, you might have your policies or procedures, but if no one's aware of them or no one pays any attention to them, you may as well not have them even. So it's very important to communicate those and be transparent about them. So choices here are yes, A, our policies and procedures are communicated well. All stakeholders are aware of them and understand them. B, internal stakeholders are aware, but not external stakeholders. And C, neither internal nor external stakeholders understand our policies very well. So take a second, and again, tell us kind of where you think your organization falls there. Okay, the poll ended, it's closed, and again, we'll just take a second for the calculations, and let's see where folks landed here. Oh, pretty much split. So we had about 29% of folks say that they're communicated very well. About 24% said internal aware, but not the external stakeholders, and about 21% of folks said that neither internal nor external stakeholders are aware. So interesting, and again, my hope is today you'll get some tips on how you can communicate those better. So today we have, or going with a slightly different format. Often our webinars we kind of do, a series of presentations by one of our featured speakers. And today we're doing kind of more of a discussion. So we have some questions that I'm going to go over and kind of moderate a discussion among our three speakers, so Greg, Mark, and Shane. And so these are some of the topics we're going to talk about. Financial policies, again, boundaries, why they're important, the different types, governance structures, decision-making, monitoring, incentives, disincentives, reinforcing cooperative behavior, incremental budgeting, sanctions and rewards, and again, removing barriers to doing the right thing. So we're going to try to touch on all of these topics in some way. Probably some will spend more time than others, but just to kind of give you guys a sense of where we're headed today. So first, we're going to get started with financial policies. So again, this webinar is all about creating clear rules, and I think putting financial policies in place is probably one of the most effective ways the finance or budget department can create clear rules. This is one of my favorite topics, actually. I enjoy helping folks develop policies and talk those out, so I'm really excited to delve into this topic a little bit more. And to get us started, I think I'd like to ask the group what advice they would give to someone who's getting started on developing some financial policies for their organization. Mark, I think you maybe had some thoughts related to how folks should think about balancing both flexibility and control. So can you speak to that? Do you want to get us started there?
Sure. So this is Mark J. from the City of Tempe. So the City of Tempe, we have several financial policies, and they've been developed over the years, and we try as best as possible to tie those to best practices, whether that's through GFOA best practices or industry standards. But we found over the years that some of our policies were a little bit rigid in the sense that, for example, they specified maybe a specific target that had to be met, and it just made it a little bit rigid for us when we tried to adhere to the policy. So, for example, we used to have a general fund reserve policy that said it had to be 25% of our general fund revenues. But when we would go back to council and review our our financials with them, we consistently exceeded that target, which brought into question of why weren't we adhering to this policy? Why weren't we spending more? Where were we over collecting from the residents? And it made us think that we needed to be a little bit more flexible in developing this policy rather than have maybe just a rigid standard. And so we came up with a different policy that provided a range because we obviously want to mitigate risk. We're a city that's heavily reliant on sales tax, and so we want to hedge against recessions or economic downturns. So we put a policy in place that had a range from 20 to 30%, and so that allowed us some flexibility with our policy and not such a rigid sense of control. And another example, another example I can give you is the state mandates an amount of levy that you can collect as far as secondary property tax, and it ties to how much property tax collections you can hold on to at one time. The challenge for us was that as property tax values go up and down, you could have wild swings in your property tax levy. And so what we decided to do is we would have to still adhere to the state statute, which kind of sets a rigid line for us. But we developed a policy that said, let's grow our levy by CPI so that there's some consistency with the residents. But what we then do kind of on the backside is we adjust our debt payments so that it equals the amount of the levy. So even though we have a rigid standard that we have to meet, we developed a policy that was a little bit more flexible so that we could still meet the legislative requirement.
No, like that makes a lot of sense. And I think that, again, the takeaway there is really that you kind of need to think about those local conditions or your not only local conditions, but just sort of what would work for your organization and really how much flexibility versus control do you want to maintain and what works. And I do think that I think another takeaway for folks is that they shouldn't be afraid to, policies aren't written in stone, and that once you develop a policy, if you need to go back and tweak it, later, that's okay. But, put the policy in place, see what works, see how it works, and then, as Mark kind of described, they realized it wasn't working for them. They kind of went back to the drawing board and revised it. That's okay too. Don't think that once you put something in place, it's there forever and can never be changed. So Shane, I'm gonna go switch to you, Shane, and see what do you think? What should people look at in their first step as they're considering down? They've got a blank slate and they're going to develop some financial policies. Like where should they start?
Sure.
Should they look at other jurisdictions? Should they start fresh? Like what do you think they should do there?
Sure. Well, I think to add a little bit to what Mark said in terms of local relevance is good, and I would probably add to that by thinking about, are there problems or difficulties you're having in your community where a policy could be a really good way to solve it? Because if so, the policy will be a lot better received, of course. So, for example, we just completed some research with the town of Queen Creek, Arizona, which is one of the first towns in Arizona to develop a local pension funding policy. So the idea being, like lots of cities, Queen Creek had a big unfunded liability for pensions, and they decided that they needed some policy guidance to help them get through that and get it to a point where it was sustainable. So they developed a policy that described the pensions they had and the level of funding that they were going to seek to achieve for each of them. And over a number of years, they were able to get to that by reviewing this policy every year with the board, helping kind of make sure it felt relevant to the board members and talking about like pain points. One of the ways that it felt relevant is to describe the opportunity costs of the higher annual required contributions that they had to make because of this large unfunded liability. So what was the town of Queen Creek giving up because they had to pay these large actuarial required contributions every year? And what they had to give up was the police services that, Queen Creek residents might want, or the recreation services, all of these different amenities for ongoing services that Queen Creek residents couldn't enjoy because they had these large unfunded liabilities that were causing them to pay a large annual and increasing annually arc. So that was sort of how they made that policy very relevant to their particular circumstance. But you could also take it the other way, because I heard a lot of folks on your polling question have a lot of informal policies, so things they're doing right now that are good that aren't written down. So you might think of it the other way, like what are some good things we're doing right now that we want to make sure we continue doing into the future, and writing those down could be a great place to start, because this financial foundation's framework is not just about leadership, it's about institution building, because we all know elected officials turnover, staff turnover. So to the extent that you can build strong institutions, your community will be a much better place, and having financial policies that institutionalize these good practices could be an excellent place to start. And maybe just
that's a great point.
Is if neither of those two things are working for you, you're like, well, none of those two fit. One other kind of approach is to just think about what we found to be like the must-have sort of policies, and kind of the must-have policies are a reserve policy that establishes a clear ceiling and floor for the reserves that you want to have, and we can get more to that later. That also this reserve policy should describe what the appropriate use of reserves are. So maybe using reserves to, say, give staff a raise, not a great use of reserves, because, of course, you've got to pay that raise every year, but reserves are essentially a one-time revenue. Speaking of that, one-time revenues is an excellent must-have policy. So what do you do with revenues that you don't expect to receive every single year? What's the appropriate use of it? User fee policy is another good one. So what is the expected level of cost recovery from fee-based services? So you could get yourself into some financial difficulties, especially if you find yourself in a legal environment where raising taxes is very difficult. Any unintended subsidization of a service is essentially taking funding away from other services that don't have the opportunity to charge fees so easily. So just let's say, for example, if you're not covering the costs of your building permit operation, which is a operation that's widely agreed to be one that should be covered by fees. If you're not covering that with fees, and you can't raise taxes, the money you're subsidizing building permits with is necessarily money that can't be used for other services that maybe you can't charge fees, like maybe that's public safety, or maybe it's certain types of recreation services, like say for disadvantaged youth that fees aren't appropriate. So that could be another good one. And then the last two are debt policies are a good one. So what are acceptable uses of debt? What are the maybe guidance on the length of debt issuance, meaning like what is the repayment period we're willing to accept? Matching up repayment periods to the underlying life of the asset that debt is financing can all be very good. And then capital planning would be the last one. As far as the must-have policy that describes or commits the organization to a long-term capital plan and funding the maintenance on the assets that it buys in order to protect the investments that the community makes in these assets.
Oh, I think that sounds like a great list. Again, I just would like to remind folks, again, I think Shane just gave us a great list, and GFOA's got a wonderful publication on this that I know I use pretty regularly here in my job at GFOA, which is the Financial Policies book, which, again, kind of really walks you through the things you need to be considering when you're putting together policies, and also has lots of references back to a lot of our best practices as well, which can also be a good starting point to get you thinking about developing some financial policies. I think I'm going to move. I think we have a poll question.
Katie, can I just interject one thing here?
Oh, please, yes, please,
sure.
Mark. Yeah.
I would just say for the City of Tempe, what's worked well for us is to be as transparent and communicate often about our policies. So whenever we're presenting to council about the budget or the operating budget or capital budget, we always remind them and review the financial policies, where we are with the policies. And on some of the policies, we've tied them to council strategic priorities, and we've developed performance measures around them to just for transparency and demonstrate that we are adhering to the policy. So any member of the public can go out to our portal and see how we're doing against our policies. And we also produce reports where the council can see, where we can demonstrate to council how we're doing against our policies.
Oh, I think thank you for sharing that. I think that's good to know, and I think that kind of also connects it a little bit to something Shane was saying, which was like, how do you make this relevant to people, right? And so I think being transparent about it, but also kind of showing the council how it applies to them, why this is relevant to them is again really important. So again, thank you for sharing that. And again, I think I'm going to click through. I think we have a poll question related to this. Yeah. Okay, so yes, question number 3, if everyone looks, we say, how can you increase the transparency of your processes for making budget and other financial resource allocation decisions? So again, this is often written in our policies, kind of how we make decisions about the budget, capital planning, those kinds of things. So how can you, what is one way, if we think about this, what is one way you think you could increase the transparency of that? So, hey, I could, A, develop a process and stick to it. I could communicate my changes broadly. I could hold internal workshops and meetings to explain the budget process and invite staff from all departments. C, develop and publish objective criteria for making resource allocation decisions. And D, publish regular budget status reports internally and externally. So I want you to think about this and really think about, like, what is something that you feel like you could commit to doing something like this. Like if I were to say, hey, I want to report back in 3 months on what have you done, something that you think is realistic. So think about that and respond, and then we'll look at everyone's answers in a minute. Okay, the poll just closed and the system is calculating answers, so I will share those in just a few seconds here. Okay, so it looks like the 25% of folks said they could hold internal workshops or meetings to explain the budget process and invite staff from all departments. I think that's actually a really valuable step, because I think a lot of us, I know in positions I held in the past, we sort of take for granted, but I think there are staff both in the finance office, the budget office, and in other departments who are really interested in learning more about how the process works, and I think holding these kind of internal workshops can be really valuable to them and kind of get those internal stakeholders more bought into the process. So 25% of folks answered B, and then 20% of folks said C, so that they could develop and publish objective criteria for making resource allocation decisions. Again, I think that's a really important thing, because when decisions are made sort of in a black box or behind a curtain and very opaque, and folks don't understand that can often lead to frustration and infighting and that kind of a thing. So I think if you can, the more objective and clear you can be about those things, it really does help strengthen your financial foundation in that way. So, so again, thanks to everyone for responding to that poll question. Want to shift gears for just a second and talk about temporal boundaries. So, Shane, if you can talk to us a little bit about sort of the value of putting in place boundaries that go beyond a year, right? So what is the value of a more long-term perspective, and why should local governments consider that?
Sure. Well, I think if you don't have that in the policy, the de facto outlook becomes 1 year ahead because it is, after all, an annual budget that local governments are required to produce by law. So, you know what they say, nature abhors a vacuum. So if there's nothing else, that will become it. 1 year ahead is how people will think. So going beyond that in a policy can be pretty powerful. So just, for example, Paul from San Clemente, I know he was going to talk about his 5-year forecast that San Clemente did, and they actually sought to be balanced over all 5 years, which is a pretty good goal. A number of other cities have done similar things. Portland has done some similar things. Oakland County has done some similar things where they actually do a 3-year budget. And actually, I saw on your slide the golden cone of prosperity somewhere, I thought. When you were flipping through.
Yeah.
So maybe that would be a good opportunity to bring that up, and maybe, Mark, you could speak a little bit to that, because I think that's yet another example of a few things that we've been talking about on this website, or on this webinar that could also
Yeah. Yeah, Mark, you want to tell us a little bit about your golden cone of prosperity?
Sure. This ties a little bit to what we're talking about financial policy, where this is a visual way for us to demonstrate to council the financial policy about the reserves between 20 and 30%. And we talked a little bit about some flexibility in your policies. And so, as you can see, we used to have a policy, it was 25%, and then we changed that to the 20 to 30%. And so we term this the golden cone of prosperity, and that's obviously where we want the general fund reserve to be. And so this is just a visual way to represent that. But if you go to the slide before that, Katie.
Yep.
So for the city, you know, statutorily, as Shane was mentioning, we have to adopt an annual budget, but we struggled with getting the council, the policymakers, to see the implications of decisions they make today over the long term. And so we developed this interactive model, and they're used to this now, so we present that twice a year as part of our long-range or operational forecast of all of our major funds. And this is for the general fund, which is our largest fund, and they're used to seeing this interactive model. And we also use this with the department directors, but what it does is it demonstrates to them, we provide them a snapshot, a little historical, and then projected, and the revenue, our anticipated revenues and expenditures, and then we say, well, if we have different levers here, if you will, and so if you would increase personnel costs by a certain percent, or increase or you would do one-time funding of positions, or you added 3 positions. If we have a process here where we do incremental budgeting, so your budget from 1 year to the next is the same, and the only way you can increase is through a supplemental process. And we say, well, how much in supplementals could we add? And so what we demonstrate to them is that if you front load this and add a lot of additional expenditures earlier in the 5-year forecast, it really limits how much you have in the future. And so this is interactive, and so at the meeting we'll actually plug in numbers, and they'll see in that golden cone of prosperity where we fall out of there. And so instead of being at between 30 and 20, all of a sudden we're down to 5. And so they start to realize that we have some restrictions on how much we can add to the budget. So it's just a good way for us to have them focus what they're deciding on the long term and not just year to year.
Yeah, and Katie, if I could add something to that, if you could go to the slide with the bigger golden cone on it.
Yep.
And slide that one, which is pretty cool about the golden cone of prosperity is when we talked about boundaries earlier, you've got pretty clear boundaries there, right? You don't need to be a financial expert to tell whether Tempe is in their boundary or not within their boundary. So I think that's pretty great. And there's also a floor and a ceiling on their fund balance. I think why this is important is, you know, fund balance gets too high, right? It becomes a target. People, hey, we got all this money, like, why don't we do something else with it? You know, perhaps something unsustainable. And having this kind of clear boundary of, like, this is the amount Tempe needs, between 30 and 20, kind of sets that floor and ceiling. And if you can connect that, like taking this idea further to the risks that your community faces, to say, you know, we've taken a look at our vulnerability to recessions, natural disasters, whatever else might be important risks for your community. And this is the amount of reserves that we need to be able to respond quickly and decisively to those risks. People will have a better understanding of why that reserve is necessary and be less apt to want to question it or use it for something else. And one of my favorite stories, in fact, about this comes from a town in the Midwest where the finance director was trying to explain the importance of keeping reserves at a certain amount. And the council was like, you know, yeah, blah, 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 we've heard it all before. And so what the finance director did is he brought the police chief to one of his presentations and had the police chief explain why it was important to have the reserve so the police could quickly and decisively respond to tornado risk. And the board all of a sudden like perked up, paid attention. They're like, oh, this is brilliant. Of course we need to have a reserve. So, you know, it's kind of about how it's presented too, in this connection to risk can be a very powerful way to help people understand why reserves are necessary.
I think that part of what's really important about this is we don't use it as dynamically as Phoenix, but casting everything within 5-year projections so that the decision makers really can see the effect of their decision making is critical. I think another critical part of the discussion has to be that their understanding that these are estimates, and the estimates are based on assumptions. So we try to carefully go over what the assumptions are that are built in to both the 1-year and 5-year projections, and they are just that, projections built on assumptions. And as we do our quarterly updates of the budget, the first thing we talk about is how are the assumptions proving out? And if the assumptions are not proving out, what kind of adjustments we need to make.
No, I think you raise a really good point there, Greg, with the, you know, making that very clear about that these are assumptions and they're you know, built on, their estimates built on that sort of thing, because I do think at some point you risk your credibility, right? That if you don't make that ultimately very clear to people, and kind of update them on how the assumptions are panning out, you're right. At some point, people just stop paying attention to you because they feel like you're Chicken Little, right? You know, you've cried wolf one too many times. So I do think being really clear about that is quite important.
And I think it's important to have a budget, understanding that the budget is a dynamic document. Based on estimates, assumptions, and we got them to move from, they were doing just annual adjustments at the time of the budget, as opposed to we moved to a quarterly system so that they saw it as constantly evolving. Mm-hmm. As we went to that kind of system and it was constantly evolving, it actually made the year-to-year budgeting less burdensome and more fluid, so that it just flowed from one year into the budget for the next.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. While we're talking about budgets, actually, I wonder if you maybe want to talk a little bit about, you started talking about this, so maybe if you want to, like when you first started as CEO there in San Bernardino County, you did make some changes to the budget process, and you were, you know, I think a lot of those were designed to get folks to cooperate more. So you kind of spoke to some of those changes, and what were some of the other changes that you put in place there really to get people to work together more?
Well, when I went to the county, the county was right on the heels of the Great Recession, and so the county had a number of financial difficulties. Though the county is very large and the entire budget at the time was about $5.5 billion, unlike cities, I had been a city manager previously. Cities, the general fund is the largest portion of the budget. In the county, because the primary business of the county is the social safety net, and then law and justice, the general fund is actually one of the smaller parts of the budget. And on that $5.5 billion budget, they had only about a $500 million truly discretionary general fund. Well, they had an $80 million deficiency the year before I came. I came right as we were going into another budget session, and it was clear we were going to, though they had closed it primarily with one-time revenues when the nature of the deficiency was ongoing. And so it popped right back open to another 80 million on the 500 million. And when we did a 5-year projection, it showed that it was going to grow to 150 million out of the 500 on an ongoing basis. They had been used to operating in a very laborious manner when it came to establishing budgets. Every single department appeared before the entire Board of Supervisors, presented their budget, the board would give input, and the budget would be redone, they would come back. And this is a very, San Bernardino County is a very large county, the 14th largest by population in the United States, and largest geographically, and multiple, over 40-some departments, all of them appearing before the Board of Supervisors. They were also, different parts of the organizations would bring their budget at different times and have their budget approved separately. So there really wasn't a consolidated presentation of the budget. So you couldn't see the whole budget together. So I convinced the board, we at the same time were changing from a county administrator to a chief executive officer. As they made that change, I also convinced them to allow me to prepare and present the budget. Now, that was also part of a larger effort to establish a county-wide vision, not just for county government, but county-wide, so that we knew that the future that the community wanted. And we did a lot of community engagement, over 20 community meetings throughout the county, over 25 groups of stakeholders on specific issues, or groups of experts on specific issues, from education, transportation, housing, healthcare, and that led to the board then determining its role in achieving that vision and creating very clear goals and objectives, which we then built the budget around. So as they allocated resources, performance measures were also developed that were part of that. So very clear goals and objectives in terms of what they were trying to achieve. And I know one of the earlier points is making sure that all of the resources are considered in terms of the jurisdictions goals and what they're trying to achieve. And all of those changes together led to a much greater understanding of what the organization was trying to achieve, what resource the elected board was providing to achieve it, and how that was going to be measured. The system that I talked about of quarterly budget updates was also a major change from the standpoint that they used to make a lot of one-off decisions. So somebody would bring forward additional personnel, and they would decide that in a meeting without really looking at the context of the whole budget. And so one of our policies that emerged out of that was that resource allocation should only be made with complete comparative context of all of your responsibilities and the totality of the financial condition of the jurisdiction. So it became a much more thorough approach to resource allocation. The problem with doing one-off decision making with resources is that it's something in top to bottom in government in the United States. We face something that I've termed the "it's all good" problem, or the problem with "it's all good" is that people don't come forward usually asking for bad things. They're asking for things that are good. More paving of roads, more jails, more sheriff's deputies, higher paid teachers, whatever it is they're asking for, or something, a festival to celebrate X, Y, or Z. The problem with that is that for decision makers, it becomes very difficult to say no to something that is taken in isolation if you don't know what your other needs and obligations are. So the real way to be able to have that discussion and get people to accept no is, yes, it would be nice to have another park, but we need more public safety.
Right.
Then we can understand. So that's why it's important to have complete comparative context. And that was part of the overall system that we implemented.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And in fact, I, again, something that became one of my mantras when I was still working in government, I used to always say, when everything's a priority, that really means nothing's a priority. You can't have it all, kind of a thing.
I have to tell you that having done this multiple times, I mean, I've primarily gone into jurisdictions that were in trouble. I will tell you that once the board establishes clear goals and objectives, in the next budget, after they've done that, they start to see areas where they're spending money that isn't in alignment or aren't in alignment with their goals.
Sure.
And then they start to adjust the allocations.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I wanted to go back, though, when you were talking specifically kind of about the, changes to the budget office and just how, how you talked about how different groups used to go at different times, different departments, whatnot, with their budget. When you came in, and again, that changed from the chief administrative officer to the chief executive officer, how were a lot of those changes received by, department heads and things like that? Like, how did that go, and how did you negotiate, navigate those relationships? Because I can imagine that, I'm just guessing, and maybe I'm wrong, but I'm guessing that was kind of difficult for you in terms of, again, kind of gaining people's trust and that sort of thing. So can you speak to that a bit?
Well, certainly getting people to learn to trust you is a process.
Sure.
You actually mentioned earlier that part of the hard part is managing relationships. And in a county, that is particularly true. In cities, especially in a council manager form of government, you have the elected council. Maybe you have a couple of other minor elected officials, maybe a clerk, maybe a treasurer, sometimes maybe a city attorney, but primarily it's the council. They then appoint a chief executive, the city manager, and in the purest form, then the city manager hires all of the departments and everyone else. The city attorney works for or reports to the city manager. It's a very clean, clear structure, and the direction becomes very clear.
Yeah.
Counties are often, though it's not universal across the United States, counties are often much more complex in terms of the form, and you have not only the elected Board of Supervisors, and at least that's what they're called in California, you also have other major elected officials, some of them constitutionally in the California Constitution mandated, like sheriffs and district attorneys, assessors, auditor controllers. So there are a host of other separately elected officials. So not only do you have to gain trust of your elected board and decision makers and the department heads, but there's a unique challenge with the separately elected officials because they do not report to you, nor do they report to the board. They are independently elected. They only answer to the people. Yes,
Sure.
the board allocates resources to them, and we monitor their expenditures and purchases, but we can't direct them as we can for departments that report through the CEO to the board. So relationship and developing relationship is critical. Part of that goes back to what we've discussed and what you've mentioned, creating clear guidelines and creating clear expectations. I ended up working very closely. We had two of the elected departments, the district attorney's office and the sheriff's office, that regularly overran their budgets. And it's a hard thing. What does a board do? What does, at that time, a chief administrative officer do when the sheriff comes in and says, okay, I spent too much money. What are you going to do? Take deputies off the street? You know, that really puts them in a tough position.
Sure.
What we began to do with our finance folks was we started getting much more involved in their budget. Not only in their budget, but how they were spending their money. And so we started asking a lot more questions. Through that, which was a very uncomfortable period, what became clear was that the sheriff, in this instance I'm using the institution of the sheriff, for decades before the current board and I had gotten there, really did not trust that the board would understand their issues nor fund them adequately.
Mm.
Therefore, the constitutionally elected sheriff would not be able to fulfill his or her duties and responsibilities. And so it was that lack of trust that was at the base of a lot of how they would budget and how they would pad their budget or sometimes try to squirrel away funds. They were once again, as a new sheriff came in, overrunning their budget, and we had some extensive conversations about why that was unacceptable and why the level of involvement from my office and from finance and administration would have to continue as long as they were overrunning their budget. Well, they didn't like the level of involvement, and so we came to an understanding on two things: that we would come to agreement on what the level of funding they needed, and that level of funding would not include funding for emergencies, for unexpected expenditures, which in law enforcement can easily happen.
Sure.
There can be many events that trigger extraordinary expenses. Well, historically, they felt they had to have money to cover those contingencies in their budget because of that lack of faith in that the board would be there for them, that the CEO would be there for them in those circumstances. So they committed to staying within their budget, reducing the padding, and I committed, after consultation with the board, that we would be there in terms of any outsized expenditures driven by unforeseen circumstances. And shortly after we had gone into that budget year, we experienced just that kind of event. A rogue officer from Los Angeles County had begun targeting police officers in several jurisdictions, had already murdered some, fled into our county. It was in winter time. We have a mountainous area, fled into the mountainous area during a major snowstorm, and there was a manhunt that went on for a several week period with, and the sheriff called me at one point and he was panicked. He said, Greg, I'm burning through money here. This is, we're not going to be able to cover this. And my answer was, John, we made a commitment. You committed you'd stay within budget. The board committed, I committed that we would cover extraordinary circumstances. This is an extraordinary circumstance. You do your job. You let us do our job. And I don't want you to think another time about whether you'll have the money. You've got whatever money you need. That changed the whole relationship. That trust started to be developed, and I have to say that the working relationship from that point through the rest of the time I was there was unbelievable. We talked all the time about what was going on, met regularly once a month with the finance staff, their staff, our staff, and trust at all levels was developed. And an understanding that nobody was trying to take their money. We were just trying to agree, which was the proper role of the board, on what it was going to be spent for, and what it would cover, and what it wouldn't, and what we shouldn't expect that it wouldn't cover. So it absolutely changed the way we worked.
Yeah, no, I think that is a great story that just illustrates again, kind of, it really encapsulates, I feel like, all 5 of the pillars in some way. But I wonder, too, I think, you know, once you establish that trust with the sheriff, I think, and I guess I'm asking, do you think that also then helped you with other departments and maybe other independently elected officials? Because, you know, he almost became like your, or did he become in a way your, like, you know, like he could say, hey, trust me, this guy's good. You know, he's good with me, so you can trust him. Like, he became almost a, I don't want to say spokesman, but do you know what I'm saying? That I feel like
I do know what you're saying, and actually that did occur. You know, the other major offender had been the district attorney. Well, it became very difficult for the again separately elected district attorney to be an outlier when the sheriff, much bigger department, much more complex department, when the sheriff committed to staying within budget, that was a signal to not only the district attorney, who then came into line, but to the entire organization that were operating differently. He often did things that set an example that was able to be used with everyone. We had not long thereafter, within California, the prison system came under a federal court order, and the state prison system was grossly overcrowded. The federal courts ordered them to find a way to reduce the population. Part of how they determined they were going to reduce the population was that they were going to send certain offenses and offenders back to the local jurisdictions, and that was going to put a strain both on the sheriff, but the county probation officers' responsibilities and administration. Now, they were sending some money with that, and that money was determined by the state legislature to go to a group within the law and justice operation of each county for allocation. When everyone went into that with great trepidation, but by then we had really started breaking down the silos within the organization, and part of that original vision and goal setting helped all of the departments, despite their individual responsibilities, to understand that all of those goals and that vision were all of our responsibility. And that was a big conceptual change within the organization. When they went into that first year of allocation, both the probation director, who was going to have significant new expenses, and I had a series of meetings, and then the sheriff and I had a series of meetings, and the sheriff went into the first meeting, which he had shared with me already what he was going to do. He went into the first meeting and said, the majority of the expenditures initially and the majority of the burden are going to fall on the probation department. And therefore, I, the sheriff, believe they should get the majority of money. Our expenditures will start hitting in 2 and 3. Well, the amount of goodwill that bought, not only within the law and justice operation, but the county as a whole, when people really saw that here was the sheriff who, more than any other office, could ignore the rules of the game and the way we wanted to operate, and could have prioritized their own needs as opposed to the highest needs within the overall organization and within the context of the vision and goals and objectives. When they saw that, then he did become that object lesson, that example for everyone to follow. And if they thought, well, if the sheriff is approaching it that way, not only should I be approaching it that way, but wow, it would be really hard for me to do something other than that.
Yeah. No, and I think what you're hitting on is, again, we talk in one of the the leadership strategy is to maintain oversight, and that, that can mean a lot of different things, and one of the ways we can maintain oversight is really by creating this culture of shared values. And that I feel like that's really what you're hitting on, is like how over time, you instituted this, and then working with the sheriff, and then working with the district attorney's office and the probation office, how over time you really did created this sense of shared values that, like you said, it was like, oh, well, if he's doing it, then I got to do it too. I better get in line. And it's
true. I've used an approach, and I think the changing the culture within an organization becomes critical, especially if it's got the jurisdiction has a lot of bad habits, and so establishing a clear vision, goals, and objectives, defining what the job of the jurisdiction is in relation to a larger vision, and then creating a clear operating paradigm. And in that operating paradigm comes a lot of the shared values. What are we trying to accomplish together? And what is the value of that? Because part of all of these approaches, talking about budgeting and resource allocation has more meaning when people understand the value of the organization and the value of the work, then it becomes a higher calling, if you will.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. I'm going to shift gears for a second and take us to talk a little bit about monitoring. Right, this is all about rules, and again, if we're setting rules, we got to make sure that people are following them. And as local government finance professionals, I think there's a lot of things that we can monitor. We can monitor spending, we can monitor performance, we can monitor how people are following policies and procedures. So we've talked about this a little bit, but I also want to talk about kind of how we monitor goals that we set in our financial policies. So, Mark, I think you have a process in place in Tempe that you assist departments in monitoring their budgets. I was wondering if you could talk about that for a bit.
Sure. We set up a process where we do what we call a quarterly report monitoring. And I think there's a slide on that. This is the report that the budget office, there we go.
Yep.
Yeah, the budget office produces at the end of each quarter. And this is provided to mayor and council as well as the public on our website. And what we do is we monitor funds, so transit fund, general fund, so revenues, if you will, and then each of the department with their expenditures. And you can see an example there of the city attorney's office, and you can see their budget, their actual expenses through the second quarter, and then we calculate a variance. And so what we do is we trend their budget against 3 years of historical spending patterns, because as everyone knows, everyone doesn't spend 25% of their budget each quarter.
Sure.
They got some seasonality in there. And so we want to take that into account. And so we assign them to make this easier to understand, because we realize that we have folks that would be reading this report or trying to understand it that may not have a financial background, but they can understand that a green would be a good sign. So we have green, yellow, red. So positive variance would mean that you're within 2% of where we think you should be, either above or below. And then yellow would be watch, you're 2 to 5%. And then negative, you'd have greater than 5%. And so when anyone enters the watch or negative area, this isn't meant to be a punitive tool so that we're trying to call out a particular department. We utilize this tool to enable us to work with the departments, particularly when we start to get into the watch area and hopefully before negative. What's going on? What's happening? Why is this? And it may be a very legitimate reason. Maybe we had a recent monsoon blew down 300 trees, and they had to spend a lot of money on cleanup, for example, in public works.
Sure.
So there may be legitimate reasons, and so we try to understand what's happened. We document that in the narrative and explain what corrective actions we're taking to try to still finish within budget. So it's a good tool. It's helped. The department has discussed their budget with their staff, and it's, like I said, we try to use graphics and visuals to help explain, so that everyone's monitored against the same standard, if you will.
And I think, and kind of hitting on something you said earlier too, which I appreciated, was that because you do these regularly, that your council has really sort of gotten used to them and is more familiar with them, and I think that's helpful, right? But I think it started out as maybe something that was instituted by an individual, but it's sort of been built up within the organization that it's become sort of it has become an institutional design principle or part of the organization, and then people come to expect it and really appreciate it. I think I think that's interesting.
Yeah, that's correct.
It's helpful to have your elected officials support there.
Right, and it's been very useful because you're right. It was more start out for the budget office. Oh, let's see how everyone's doing, kind of thing, and following up. But we realized there was value into. I mean, everyone's playing by the same rules here, so everyone's being monitored the same, and there's some accountability here then, with departments staying in their budget, and and it's interesting when we have new employees, and this is part of our orientation about the budget office and budgeting. We go over this report, so it has become institutionalized even within the staff too. They know where this report is, and it's available on our website. Anyone can go out and look at it. So we're not trying to hide anything. We're very transparent about how we're doing as a city.
And I think to your point that you said too, that it's not meant to be punitive or punish, that the fact that it's in a red, isn't like, you're not trying to make somebody look bad, that it's really just part of a tool. I think that kind of the way you approach it is also really important, because you could easily, I feel like, turn people off, but that it's done in a spirit of collaboration is helpful.
Yeah, Katie, maybe I can jump in here. I'd be curious.
Yeah.
Because I think all that's true, but at the same time, I'm guessing no one relishes being a red.
That is true.
Yeah, right. So, I guess my point is sometimes it is a little punitive, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because I think we can get carried away sometimes with, the kind of everyone's got to feel good about it. There's actually some benefit, right? Like, let's take Greg's example of the district attorney, right? What happened when the sheriff, kind of playing by the rules? The district attorney didn't want to be the guy sticking out like a sore thumb, right? Just like in Mark's chart here, you don't want to be the person in red. Like the city attorney, same thing. I don't want to be the person in red. So that social pressure is actually, I think, very key to monitoring and making sure these systems. So to the extent that, because what Tempe is doing here, which is great, is that everyone's actions are transparent. You can see there's a city attorney's office, there's city clerks, so we can see exactly what they're doing. And their reputations are actually, are on the line, right? Because they're kind of right there, red, green, yellow. And to what Mark is saying about, not treating people unfairly, like if there's some mitigating circumstances that get to explain, for sure. But, at the same time, there are people's reputations are at stake. And that is an incredibly powerful self-monitoring tool.
Right. No, I think that's a really good point. I'm going to take a break for a second and shift to we have lots of great info still to cover, but I want to go to a polling question. So I think we've talked a lot about, getting people to fall in line and creating sort of this culture of shared values and monitoring and these, again, things to sort of help reinforce that cooperation and collaboration. But I think sometimes we have barriers to doing the right thing. So what do you think could be a barrier to doing the right thing in your organization? And the choices we have here are incremental budgeting, use it or lose it budgeting, imposing equal or across the board budget cuts, right? So if we have to cut our overall budget by 10%, so everybody's just going to cut 10% regardless of anything, everyone's just going to get the same equal amount of cut. How can that be a barrier to doing the right thing? And then I think also sometimes this can be a barrier is what I call the stay in your lane organizational culture, right? So don't ask any questions about anybody else, just do what you're doing and stay in your lane. So what do you think is a barrier or any of these barriers to doing the right things in your organization? So take a minute there and respond, and we'll share answers in a second. Okay, so we have our answers here, and it looks like the largest percentage here, 38% of folks said use it or lose it budgeting. Smaller percentage, 22% of folks said the stay in your lane organizational culture. I know I've definitely worked in places that have that kind of a culture, and it can be very frustrating. And a smaller percentage, the 11% said imposing equal across the board budget cuts, and 3% of folks said incremental budgeting was a barrier to doing the right thing. And Greg, I'm wondering if you can, speaking of use it or lose it budgeting, I think you have this was one of the changes, I think, and again, I think this might be an example with your sheriff's office, but how you kind of moved away from a little bit the use it or lose it budgeting and kind of got to a better place for the organization. Can you share that with us?
Sure. Part of the changing the way that we all work together and changing the culture and the relationship really was understanding more thoroughly the perspective of the departments and their perspective of their needs. San Bernardino County is not a wealthy county, and certainly though we were always financially balanced in our budgets, we were hardly what I would call programmatically balanced. So we always had programmatic needs, infrastructure needs. There were lots of unfunded liabilities. And so as we moved, and I put that out there because there are circumstances where this would be more difficult. But in an instance where you aren't programmatically balanced and there are lots of needs, and departments have been padding their budgets, hiding money to try to protect themselves and their turf, then as you understand, as finance administration understands, more about their needs. Part of what we did was we started committing to those departments that savings would stay within their department. We wanted them to use the money more effectively. So both in the sheriff's operation, same thing in probation, both of them had significant equipment and facility unfunded liabilities or unfunded needs. And so instead of the tug of war that would go on trying to pry those money looses and having budget battles every year, we went to them and said, look, we agree you have lots of unmet needs, and that those needs are important, they are critical. And any discussion we have amongst ourselves, anything you come up with that saves money or is a better use of money, we will let you keep that money and redirect it to those area of need. With the sheriff, they had gotten, we're 20,000 square miles, the largest geographic county in the United States. The sheriff needed a fleet of aircraft, helicopters, small planes, just to be able to respond to incidents within the jurisdiction. Fire needed the same kind of thing. Probation needed lots of facilities throughout the county. We committed to those monies staying within those departments. So in the sheriff's instance, they had acquired a lot of surplus military helicopters that were reaching the end of their useful life. They had a number of them. Each of them were going to cost $5 million to replace. We committed to, look, if you can find savings, we're not going to try to take that savings. You don't have to worry about trying to spend it every year on things that aren't yours or the county's highest priority. Let's agree on what those highest priorities are at the board level, the elected level, where it should be, and at the staff level. And we'll commit. If you come in $2 million under budget in terms of overtime expenditures, put that in a sinking fund or a reserve to replace those helicopters. And we were able to, once again, it made the whole discussion of budgeting and expenditure much easier, because now it was no longer a threat. It was no longer about protecting their resource.
Yeah, no, I can imagine that's huge. And excuse me, I do think, to your point, saying that, it wasn't, the county wasn't super wealthy, like it did have some issues. So I think it was not an easy commitment to make, I can imagine, but still, and as a result, went a long way to building those relationships and getting those departments to think more long-term, more efficiently.
Well, it helped even something that was brought up earlier. I think Shane talked about subsidizing activities by not charging full costs. Well,
right.
The sheriff was doing a lot of things that were relationship-based. It helped them with other law enforcement agencies. We have a big training center. Giving that training for free or allowing people to use the facility for free. Until finance and I engaged in a discussion with them about, you understand that you're not charging, and that means that's money you're not getting, because we would leave that money in the department. So think about, is that really what you want to be doing?
Mhm.
Relationship more important than the helicopter replacement that you need.
Right, right.
So it changed, again, the nature of the discussion. We were no longer the enemy. We were the ally, helping them find ways to better use their money.
Right. Makes sense. I kind of want to switch gears for a second. Mark, I know you have an interesting performance management initiative that I'd love for you to kind of talk about and share with us, because I think that obviously performance management is a huge component to monitoring. I think, you know, we at GFOA are proponents of performance management. These can often be, you know, daunting undertakings. But I'm wondering if you can kind of talk us through that. And but which slide should I start with here?
If you go back a couple more, right there. Oops, one more.
Oh, sorry. Yep.
Sorry.
Perfect.
One more.
No, thank you.
Just one more slide.
Oh, forward?
Yes.
This one?
There we go. Yep.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's all right. So at the city, we've had performance measures for a number of years, but what we found is that they weren't really tied to the budget process and how resources were allocated and the budget decisions that were made by council. So in trying to get council to maybe avoid one-off decision making regarding the budget and look more long-term and be more effective with our resources, we started an initiative probably about 3 years ago about performance-led budgeting. And so the first thing we did was work with council to help them identify their strategic priorities. And as you can see, we have 5 priorities that were identified. And we use symbols and colors, as you can see, to help kind of convey the message. And then if you can go back one slide. In order for us to assess how we're doing against those priorities, we set up 2 processes. One was each of the departments were responsible for developing performance measures, outcome-based, that tied directly to the priorities. So we started with over 100 and some performance measures, which is a little unwieldy. So we're down to 99 now. And then we also created a performance data portal because we wanted to have transparency in this process and show the public as well as council how we're doing against these performance measures in order to meet the council priorities. So if you go forward a few slides, so this is a portal. It's open. It's a public site. You can see the 5 priorities are listed below. And you can click on those priorities and then see all the measures that go with them. And then the next slide, I can just give you a few examples. So, for example, payment quality index, their target is a 70 PQI, payment quality index, and right now they're at 59. So it tells where we are in meeting the strategic priorities, but it helps frame the discussion when we get to the budget process. So if you go forward, there's a few more. So here's our renewable energy. And as I mentioned, there's 99 of these. And then if you go to the next one, this is actually for the budget office. We want a revenue forecast variance of plus or minus 3% on our local taxes and intergovernmental revenue.
So this is, Mark, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. This is, I just want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. This is kind of grading you on how well you've done your forecasting?
Yes, it is.
So I love that.
Our goal, our target is that we want to be so that the actual revenues received at the end of the fiscal year were plus or minus 3% of what the budget is. And, you know, the budget is established. We do a lot of regression analysis and other methods to come up with the budget, but it represents these 2 revenue sources are 73% of our general fund revenue. So it's really critical that we get that number right, but we're very transparent in how we're doing with that. So this is, as you can see, for 18-19, we met our target. So.
Well, and I just want to say, I think it's also, just going back to this slide that showed the 5 strategic priorities, the fact that the community, the council even has financial stability and vitality as a priority, I think says a lot and really, again, helps with that sort of shared culture, values and things like that make the job of the finance officer a little bit easier, because it's, that it's also going back to Greg's point about it's all good. When you have to consider financial stability and vitality, you have to make trade-offs. So
right.
I think it's important to me that they've even recognized that as a priority.
Right. And one of the things that the performance measures have done for us is focus the council on outcomes. Tell us the outcome that you want rather than a specific resource or budget decision. So, for example, and we've said, our CFO has said this to council, please don't tell me that we need 2 officers to patrol the parks at night. Is your
right.
goal that the feeling of safety in the parks should be increased? If that's your goal, let us come back and tell you what the resource needs are.
Yeah.
And so
sure.
these measures have helped us focus them on outcomes and not trying to make specific budgetary decisions.
Sure. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and then as it relates to the department, so if you go forward to the next slide, we do incremental budgeting. We have a supplemental process. So if you want to add to your budget, you are required to submit a supplemental with your additional resource need request. But we've really gotten the departments to focus on looking at your performance measures, which measures are you not meeting, and how are you going to meet that performance measure. We would encourage that you would collaborate cross-departmentally with other departments. So, for example, if you're trying to address a homelessness issue in the city, that's going to be an issue that's probably going to involve human services, community services, parks, and police. So you may submit a joint supplemental to address that. You could shift resources. So maybe you're way above your target on a performance measure. Maybe you should shift some of those resources that you already have towards a measure that you're not meeting. And then the last one would be, well, maybe you do need some additional funds. And then we get the council involved, and that's the next slide here. We've given them an interactive tool. And so it's hard to say, well, what are your priorities, council? Where do you think we should focus our resources? So next month, we're going to have them we're going to provide them this tool. It's called the START tool, or Strategic Tool for Aligning Resources in Tempe. We provide them all the 99 measures, where the target is, where people currently are. We also provide them the residential and business surveys. We give them $100 and say you need to allocate $100 over these 99 priorities or performance measures. And then we tabulate those and come back to them and say, these are the measures that have risen to the top that you want us to focus on. And then if you go to the next slide. So as part of the budget process, we say, okay, council has identified these measures as top priorities. So in last budget cycle, there were 3 measures that rose to the top: feeling of safety in the city, feeling of safety in the parks, and pavement quality index. And so we developed what we call acceleration models to allocate more resources towards those measures. So, for example, on the next slide, you'll see pavement quality. They told us with their current funding that they would not reach their target until 2028, and council said that's too long. And so on the next slide, and we showed this to council, this is interactive models. So we provided, as part of the budget process, additional funding to them so that they could reach that target a lot sooner. So it's helped us frame
Yeah.
For the budget process, instead of having these one-off decisions, everyone's playing by the same rules. Everyone has measures. We know who's not meeting their targets, who needs resources, but we have limited resources, so we get council to kind of give us some direction of what is the top priorities. Where do you want us to focus our efforts and our resources?
I have a question kind of as a follow-up to this. Your models and your estimates and that sort of stuff, are you producing that in-house? Do you have outside consultants helping you with that? What are this is really great information, and how are you putting all that together?
So we created a Office of Strategic Management and Diversity about 3 years ago. So there is a staff. It is kind of a heavy lift. There is a staff that helps the departments put together the measures. And we also have 3 or 4 people that help with the data, if you will, the data portal. So, but council made this a top priority, and so that's how we were able to do this as far as put the resources towards it.
No, that's great. I just, for the other folks out there, I just wanted to kind of let them, let them know what it might take to do something like this.
Yeah, and I think the key is start small.
Sure.
Some departments have dragged their feet on this, but when they realized resources weren't allocated to them because they hadn't developed performance measures, they kind of got on board pretty quickly. So.
Sure. Well, and I think that speaks to we talk about how using the power of the purse strings to reinforce good behavior. And so, if you get rewarded financially through your budget for doing the right thing, then the others start to get in line.
Right. And just be realistic. What we're showing you here is obviously, years in the making, 3 to 4 years of effort. So, but it took us time to get there. So we started out small, and we got there.
Very helpful. I think we have covered a lot of ground here. A lot of the topics that I wanted us to get to, we have covered. I guess I just wanted to touch base with the 3 panelists to see if you all had any closing thoughts that you wanted to share. Again, closing thoughts you might want to leave our listeners with today. Anybody can jump in.
Yeah, I can go. So, one thing I thought might be interesting here, useful for people, is back to the financial policies topic. I think we touched on this a little bit, but a lot of times in our profession, we jump into what is the policy, how are we going to develop it, and we don't talk as much about why the policy is important to have to our stakeholders. And this is important because though we know why the policy is important, they may not, and so kind of helping them gain that same appreciation can be pretty useful. So I've got a little link to a video by Simon Sinek called Start With Why. It's this TED Talk that explains the relevance of kind of beginning your conversation about a thing that you want people to do with why it's important as opposed to what the thing is or how you're going to do it. And I'd love to share that with the entire group, so hopefully I can do that right now. So if you have your chat function available to you, I have just sent you a link to a YouTube video by Simon Sinek, so I'd encourage you to check that out, because I think it would help you when you're framing all these kind of monitoring tools for people, be it policies, budget practices, whatever else. Starting with why is a great way to help people understand the importance of these things. So if you lead with what, people might kind of start out with the assumption, well, this is just something finance is doing to make my life more difficult or whatever else. But if they understand the reasons why you're doing it, could be a lot more potentially powerful.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I think that's super helpful. I think, again, we always have to reinforce why this is relevant to people. So I think that's super helpful. And I will definitely check out that TED Talk. So thank you for that. Greg or Mark, any kind of closing thoughts you wanted to leave folks with today?
Well,
I would just, go ahead, Greg.
Thanks, Mark. Given the kind of roles I've played, I'm always looking at it from the perspective of how do you get the electeds to come along. And the one thing that I would encourage jurisdictions that haven't formalized policies, getting electeds to establish financial management policies is actually easier than you think and far more beneficial. It's easier because it really is hard for them to say that they're against any of the basic good budgeting and good financial policies. So if you're to the point where you can have that discussion publicly, it's very hard for them to say, no, I don't want to balance the budget every year. I don't want to look long term. It's very hard for them to say that. Once they're in place, it's a lot easier once they've publicly adopted them and the public too is then holding them accountable to them and for them, then it's a lot easier as staff to maintain a solid financial footing.
Thank you. That's actually very, that was helpful and good to hear, I think. I was surprised by it, and I'm glad to hear that it's, in your experience, it hasn't been as hard. But once you started talking and saying, like, yeah, it's hard to be against a balanced budget, like, that makes a lot of sense. So thank you. And then, Mark, did you have any final thoughts you wanted to share?
Yeah, I was just going to say, wherever possible, communicate your policies, the rules, the boundaries, and be collaborative. It's really helped us that we have clear, defined rules or processes in place about, for example, how we fund the CIP or the supplementals, that everybody understands exactly the parameters. They understand the golden cone of prosperity, the resources available. So whenever we have the opportunity, we try to emphasize these are the policies, this is how the process works, and everyone, is really cooperative. And I don't get the sense that people feel like anyone's gaming the system, that we're all playing by the same rules.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right, and I think the clear communication really helps with that, being open about things. So before we end, I do have two more poll questions, and speaking right about collaboration and cooperation is this next one. So if you say, in terms of collaboration and cooperation, how would you describe your organization? And not just your department, but your overall city, county, or your special district, wherever your organization is. So how would you describe of the three here before? A, staff from different departments at varying levels cooperate regularly on lots of different projects and initiatives. B, executive management talks about collaboration and cooperation, but no one really does it. We're open to the idea, but nervous about working with people from other departments on major projects. And C, no one really talks about collaboration. It's neither encouraged nor discouraged. Everyone just keeps their head down and does their job. So kind of, think about your organization. Where do you think you fall? Respond, and we'll take a look at those responses in a few minutes here. So. Okay, the poll just closed, and the system is kind of calculating the responses. Oh, so good news. About 54% of folks responded with A, that staff from different departments and at varying levels collaborate and cooperate regularly. So glad to hear that. There was only 8%, 3 respondents who said C. So glad to hear that. And those of you who said C, I really hope maybe today you got some good tips on how you can begin to change that. And then our last poll question is, what are some things you can do to help create a culture of collaboration in your department? Again, I encourage you to think about these, like what do you think is realistic? What do you think you could truly commit to doing? One is maybe hold regular staff meetings to give updates, something very simple, right? B is ask for feedback and input and do something with the information you receive. So I think a lot of the times we ask for feedback and input from people and we just never do anything with that, but actually do something with that information. And C is design interactions that require cross-team collaboration. So like one example was if you require RFP evaluation teams to include staff from different divisions, but how do you, specifically design things to make people work together? Or D is all of the above. So kind of what is something you think is doable for you to commit to doing? So again, good news. Most people said that they could do all of the above. 59% of respondents said that they could do all of the above. So that I am really encouraged and glad to hear that. So that is really I'm just gonna kind of close here, wrap up. First thing I want to do is thank all my speakers today. I want to thank Greg, Mark, and Shane for stepping in at the last minute. I also want to thank Paul because while he couldn't talk today, he really did do a lot to kind of help us think through this and organize it and gave us some good suggestions on questions to ask. So thank you, Paul. Another thing I want to mention is, again, I mentioned earlier, but we do have our book coming out very soon, Financial Foundations for Thriving Communities. That will be available for purchase on our website. It is a great book. We're also going to have it available as an ebook, so that's exciting. Also, we have 2 more webinars coming up. This has been a series that started back in July, so we have the 2 final webinars. On October 10th, we will have the webinar about treating people fairly. That's pillar number 5 of the framework. And on October 24th, we have our, it's kind of called the Putting It All Together webinar. So that's going to be kind of how all the 5 pillars come together to strengthen your organization's financial foundation. So if you're interested in this topic and want to learn more, I encourage you to check out those 2 webinars. And again, I really encourage everyone to keep contacting us with questions, comments, and success stories. This is something GFOA is really committed to. We're very much interested in, getting this framework out to as many people as possible. And one of the ways we do that is really by hearing from you and sharing your success stories, because really the way people, I feel like, get to implement this is hearing about what other people did and how it worked for them. So feel free to reach out to me. Again, my name's Katie Ludwig. I'm kludwig@gfoa.org, or feel free to reach out to Shane, my colleague. And then finally, the other thing I want you all to check out is, and I meant to mention this earlier, but we have this great audio series. They're sort of like podcasts. They're pretty short in length. You can listen to them while you're walking to work, while you're in the car, while you're on the train. But they're focused on our new code of ethics and on the financial foundations for thriving communities. And there's a great one that was recently released that is all about how to build trust. And it's really just a kind of an individual case study of one thing that this woman was a new CFO in a city and what she did to build trust amongst her peers. And there really are some good lessons to take away. So those are also available on our website, so I encourage you to check those out. So thanks again, everyone. Appreciate your time.